Once again, the colors that I'll be using for my explanation of the watercolor techniques are phthalo green and crimson. You do not need to have the exact same shades, but it is a good idea to use contrasting colors. The watercolor glazing technique is a layering technique where transparent washes of paint are applied over dried layers, creating depth and richness in color. First, a light wash is laid down and allowed to dry completely. So here I apply a light wash of the crimson color and load more color onto my brush and apply it on the wet sheet of paper, and this is done wet on dry. Once this has dried completely, I go in with a dilute mix of my second color. A subsequent layer of transparent color is added, and you can see how the watercolor layer underneath is visible over this layer of blue. The hard lines from the underlying red layer is visible over the phthalo green. The watercolor layering technique is a technique by which we build richness and intensity of colors layer over layer on wet paper. So for my initial layer, my paper is dry initially and I pick up some of the red pigment and lay it down on my paper in an arbitrary stroke pattern. I intensify this color some more and then I proceed to pick up my second color, which I layer on top of the first color while my paper is still wet. This causes natural blending on the paper of pigments, and since our pigments were complementary, we get a dark color which is almost black. Lifting of wet paint is a technique that can be used to create highlights in your work. It can also be used to correct mistakes in case you accidentally lay a color onto your paper. First, dip your brush in clean water and then dab it onto your paper towel to absorb the excess water off the brush. The brush acts like a sponge at this point and absorbs all the excess color that is on the wet paper. Remember that for this technique, the paper has to be wet as you lift the colors off. You can continue to do this for as long as you see the colors still coming off the paper. The watercolor masking and gouache techniques are techniques that are used to preserve highlights on your paper. Masking fluid is a fluid that you can apply on your watercolor sheet to preserve white areas. I use the end of my brush to get some masking fluid and I apply this masking fluid in a circular pattern over my paper. The masking fluid is a rubbery liquid that becomes waterproof once it's dry, and so when you apply watercolors on top, the area that is masked off does not absorb any of the color. When you remove the masking fluid after the procedure, you are left with a clean white space. We need to wait for the masking fluid to dry completely before we proceed with painting our layer on top of it. So I lay down some water and then I get my crimson color and dab it onto my wet paper. You can see that the areas which are masked off are repelling the water, and this helps us preserve the white spaces underneath. Once we have applied our paint, we need to wait till the paint is completely dry before removing the masking fluid. So now that my paper is bone dry, I go in with a cement pickup and I gently remove the masking fluid off the surface. A cement pickup is not necessary and you can definitely use your fingertip to remove the masking fluid too. Another method that you could use to create white highlights on your work is to use an opaque medium called gouache. Gouache has larger pigments than watercolor, which means that they do not have the transparency that watercolors have, and so you can use them to add white highlights, like you see me do here. The white watercolor available on your palette is a bad choice for this, since watercolors are transparent. The next method is the salt method, and this is a great method for adding texture easily to your work of art. First, I take some of my phthalo green pigment and I lay it down on my paper. I make a good intense coat of phthalo green, and just for some contrast and some deeper colors, I add some crimson on top of it. Then I pick up some of my rock salt and I sprinkle it on top of the paints that are still wet on the surface of the paper. You really don't need all too much salt for this. It is sufficient to put just a small amount and you have to be patient while it dries. For both the masking fluid and the salt technique, it is a good idea to let this dry naturally and not use a hair dryer in case you do that. That is because you would not be able to see the salt effect if the paper dries too quickly. Now that my paper is dry, I brush off the excess salt using a bone dry brush, and you can see the effect that we have. So that is it for this set of techniques. See you in the next lesson.